Hello, everyone. I think we'll get started now. Welcome to another installment of our Vivli webinar series. My name is Ida Sim. I'm professor of medicine at UCSF and co-founder of Vivli. Today, we're super excited to address the topic of sharing academic clinical research data with a fantastic lineup of institutional leaders. Before I introduce them, I want to note that today is the observance of Juneteenth. It's an important holiday. I do realize that this is a day off for many institutions and many people, so I thank our presenters for participating with us today, and also thank you, our audience, for being here as well. So we're going to go on with our show, and first is a few housekeeping issues. After the presentation, we will be sending a link to the recording and the slides. And please post your questions via chat, and we'll respond to your questions at the end. There will be time for Q&A. Participants will be muted, so I will be reading your chat question off, and we do want to expect a lively discussion, and we have left time for questions. So our panelists today are Dan Ford, Johns Hopkins Vice Dean of Clinical Investigation. We also have Susanna Nagy, who is the Duke Vice Dean for Clinical Research. Kim Serpico, Harvard Associate Director for IRB Operations. And Ara Tomasian, Harvard Chief Research Compliance Officer. And I will be moderating this session. So the agenda for our hour here, we've done the welcome and introductions. I will give an overview of the institutional components required for data sharing, and we will have some brief reactions from the panel, and then also the panelists discuss what is working and what are the pain points at their particular institutions. And we will also have an IRB perspective on data sharing, because that has come up to be an area of deep interest, let's just put it that way. Then we'll have a question and answer session. So let us go on with our presentation here. So just as a background, I'm sure many on the call here are familiar with the journey that we've had on transparency in clinical trial data, starting with a requirement for registering clinical trials that started back in the mid-2000s or so. Journals were requiring that clinical trials be registered as well, which gave us, of course, the awareness that a trial was in progress and was planned. And of course, we followed that up with a requirement that summary level data be shared with the FDAR rule, and summary data here meaning things like, the odds ratio and the confidence interval around that. We're now moving towards sharing the participant level data itself, sometimes also called the row level data. And of course, that's important because that's how we can put data together, not just the summaries, and to do reanalysis. It really powers the reviews and the value of the data that's being shared. And multiple policies that have advanced the state of sharing of individual participant level data, or IPD. And we're seeing that this is going to accelerate with the new data sharing policy from the NIH coming into effect in January 2023. If you haven't seen it, just a quick overview of it. Proposals to the NIH, all proposals, there's no more of the direct budget over 500,000 criteria. All proposals must include a 2-page data sharing plan detailing the who, what, when, where, and how of data sharing. And indeed, NIH strongly encourages the use of established repositories such as Vivli and others. Data should be made accessible as soon as possible. As you can see here, budget may be included in your proposed budget. The data sharing plans are not going to be reviewed as part of peer review, although peer reviewers can comment on it and on the budget without impacting the overall score. If you are funded, NIH will be holding you to your data sharing plan. And because this comes into effect in January 2023, investigators should be thinking about this in 2022, which means that institutions and institutional leaders should be thinking about how we support our investigators now. And this is really the impetus of our group getting together. We sort of went around and tried to think about, well, what do institutions, academic medical institutions need to support our investigators in anticipation of this NIH data sharing? requirement that's coming up. So I'm just going to give a very brief overview. These are sort of 4 big buckets of institutional support: outreach, training, and investigator support, data stewardship and metrics, legal compliance, and academic affairs. So I'm going to go through just a highlight of each of those. On outreach and training, it's actually really important. Why share even, right? And what is being shared, and how is sharing human studies data, as it is from clinical trials, is really quite different from sharing, mouse data or, other kinds of analytics data from life sciences, and also different from sharing electronic health record data from, from routine clinical care. Really very different considerations. How to communicate that, how to communicate policies like the NIH, mandates from journal editors, like from the International Committee for Medical Journal Editors. Private funders are increasingly requiring data sharing. And of course, there's a mix of data sharing platforms out there, not just Vivli, others you may have heard of, Figshare, Dryad. It can get really confusing. How to communicate this, who does the communication, who's the audience, how do we train all the various participants in clinical trials on the institutional side. And where does this sit in the institution? I think that question is going to come up over and over again. Where does this sit in our institutions? To support investigators, there are also some key questions. This is a piece from our Vivli support. Does the investigator want an independent review of people who may be requesting their data? Data does need to be anonymized. What does that mean? Who can help me with it? Do you want to share your data right away? Do you need an embargo? Do you want people to just be able to download your data? Or do you require that they have access to it only in a secure research environment? I think many of our investigators are not familiar with thinking through these kinds of questions. How do we support them? And what institutional policies might we have that we should be advising on? Data stewardship and metrics is actually very, very important. Data and associated artifacts from a trial do need to be shared, and it's very hard to share that as an afterthought. It is much better if we could think about data sharing from study inception, and the thinking about things like interoperability standards. So when your data set comes out, it's shareable. You've got your provenance. All the data is clean and clear. Common data elements. What are the variables that you're using? Are they clearly defined? Are they shared variables? All that is really hard to do, and in some cases impossible to do after you've done your trial without thinking about this. So if we were to think about data sharing from the beginning, who does that? Who has the money to do that? What is the infrastructure to support that? And that, I think, is clearly an institutional responsibility and definitely a challenge. I think we also want to be forward-looking. We're moving to decentralized clinical trials, of course, with mobile, virtual clinical trials, especially with the pandemic. But we're also looking towards real-world evidence, where data is going to be collected from routine clinical care. There may be protocol-generated evidence data on top of that. How do we think about the whole cycle of data management? And then, of course, institutional process metrics to keep us aware of where we are. Moving on to legal and compliance, certainly a lot of issues there as well. Institutional data licensing, data contributor agreements do need to be signed. Data use agreements need to be signed for those who are requesting data and receiving data. Individuals do need to sign this, but institutions also do need to, be involved in the process. And so, for an investigator, it's often hard to know who needs to sign those agreements, and maybe they've already been signed, or if there are clauses in there that are confusing, who do they reach out to, and are they doing the right thing? Many academic trialists are partnering, of course, with commercial sponsors. And where is the line between, the responsibility for data sharing and also the legal and compliance issues around that data sharing? And of course, there's always concern about IP issues and so forth. Lots of IRB questions as well, and we have fortunate to have an expert on with us today to address IRB. So I will not discuss that further, but hold your questions until she's able to present them. On the legal and compliance, I would say that is often also spread out across the university, and different approaches to thinking about data sharing, perhaps with the frame of IT governance and data security. That's a perfectly reasonable frame. Another frame is one of patient privacy, and a perfectly reasonable frame, and one that's very important. And then there's another one that might be thinking of data sharing really as a scientific opportunity. And I think those all perspectives need to be accommodated, and I'm sure that we will get into that as well in our discussion. So the final chunk here is academic affairs. Super important that those who are participating in data sharing get some benefit out of it. At Vivli, we have seen many investigators access data sets that they could not otherwise access and have published and are very excited about the kind of science that they can do. For those who are contributing data, it might not be so obvious why. You know, it is hard to do this with the data cleaning and anonymization. How do we incentivize this? How do we capture the benefits of data sharing? Not just did you publish an article out of it, maybe you used your data and maybe use somebody else's data and you were able to optimize your clinical trial design. Well, that has scientific value, but you're not going to publish on it. How do we capture that impact on science? How do we capture the impact on society? And how do we make sure that the credit for that flows back to both the data contributors and the people who are doing secondary analysis? Whatever system of academic incentives and credit that we come up with, I think we do need to track the effect on things, you know, academic currency like citations, definitely the effect on promotions, that really goes to, you know, how we think of ourselves as scientific citizens. And that's, of course, a big discussion. Do want to also flag the importance of career and promotions prospects for what some people have called third space professionals. And these are people who are going to make data sharing possible. This is your not just your IT staff, but your research informatics staff. Many of your institutions have people who are handling the research data sharing. They are very highly skilled, very committed to science and data sharing, but aren't on the faculty track. And they need a career, they need training, and they need a promotions prospect as well. And that's something I think we need to intentionally build in our infrastructure for data sharing. So I'm going to stop and ask each of our panelists to just have a brief 2-minute response to the thoughts I presented. Really just to give us your thoughts at the policy level. And then after 2 minutes of each, we'll then have 5 minutes for each of them to go more in depth on the what's working at your institution and what are the pain points at your institution. These are some questions just to kick it off, but of course you can more than welcome to you know, address any point, any issue that you want. So we're going to move into the 2-minute brief response phase of our webinar here, and we'll start with Dan Ford, who's the Johns Hopkins Vice Dean for Clinical Investigation. Dan, if you could, oh, there you are. Good. Okay, we're all on camera. That's great. Okay, Dan, go ahead.
Right. Well, thank you, Ida. It was a great introduction. I think this is a topic that our research community is talking about, for sure. There's variation of enthusiasm for it from some that have totally embraced this. And in fact, the more they've had a chance to use somebody else's data, the more it sounds like a great idea. But we do have others that have been, you know, very, very siloed. And I do think that, you know, while we're changing the culture, it does help if there's a clear compliance message that states that, you know, it's paying for everybody, but it is now a requirement. And that isn't quite clear coming. And then there are issues, the technical issues, which do require, I think, institutional support. They can't do it all, but you need to, the research teams need to know where they can go from help, for help. And I think we've seen this, and maybe later on I'll talk about, like, to me, it's close to what we've done with the CT.gov registration process, where you need both technical help and they have to be able to work with the IRB and research administration, and people in groups that are often siloed, and they have to be put together to help the research faculty achieve this. Because the easiest thing for any researcher to say who doesn't want to share is it's too hard to share. There's too many technical barriers. You fix those, and then I'll share. And we've got to really make sure that that isn't a easy excuse, and that we facilitate the data share.
Thank you, Dan. Right on comments, right in. Let's move on to Susanna Nagy, who is the Vice Dean for Clinical Research.
Great, thank you, Ida, and thank you again for having me today to share the stage with these phenomenal people to talk about this. So I guess what I would add is I think these policies are actually really important, and I think it's really nice to see this level of movement towards an emphasis on open science kind of across the board in the US, by the EMA, for publications in journals, for the NIH and funding agencies, so that it becomes really clear that this is an expectation of how we move science forward. I think, as Dan mentioned, this does now require a change in culture and how we think about what science and team science looks like, what collaboration looks like, and how do we move that forward in a new way. And I think for us, it's going to require quite a bit of education, really ensuring that our faculty and scientists understand the why, and ultimately, in my opinion, the benefit to them, and how this allows us to ensure that our commitment to participants is upheld, which I think is a really critical piece of this. So I've always found that when you move forward new initiatives like this, it's important for our faculty to understand the why, to get them on board and to bring in that level of commitment, because this is going to take a lot of resources. It is a change in how we think about collaboration and sharing and team science. But I do believe that if we can start at education, that we can get to the right place.
Indeed, it is the beginning of a long journey. Well, somewhat in the middle of a long journey. It is a long, whatever it is, it's a long journey. Next is Ara Tomasian, Harvard Chief Research Compliance Officer.
Thanks, Ida, and again, thanks for the opportunity to part of the conversation, and thanks to the participants, and we're looking forward to the questions. The good news about going last is that everything good has been already said, and you can say I agree. So, but I really do agree with what Dan and Susanna said, and you did a great job of summarizing the sort of complex issue. I really want to start by echoing the sort of important factor is that while it is important that we have to comply with this, especially with NIH, is we're looking for NIH funding. I think that as an institutional level, our focus should be how do we facilitate this, and I think that's going to be the success of this. And as Susanna said, and Dan alluded to, we really have to sort of start presenting this to the faculty as why it's good for the science, why it helps sort of the science advancement, and I know we're going to get into more conversation about that, but that, we really work hard to provide the infrastructure that they need. This means that we develop institutional implementation plans with the focus of how is going to be easy for the research community to meet their obligations, both for complying with the NIH requirement, but more importantly with sharing. You mentioned some of the key issues. Obviously there's going to be compliance, regulatory issues in terms of anonymizing, sort of providing the help, guiding them through the process. Also, sort of making it easy for data sharing. That may mean that we will have to rethink some of our data sharing agreement or data use agreements, and sort of addressing those things within the context of this broader issue of what Susanna referred very nicely to, this sort of collaborative open science. So I think that's kind of very quickly what I would add to what has already been said.
Great, and that's a great segue into the next section, which is digging down into the concrete things that we need to do as an institution to support our investigators. So 5 minutes each, we want to hear what is working at each of your institutions and what are the pain points as well. I suspect our pain points are definitely shared. So Dan, 5 minutes on how things are going at Hopkins around this issue. And I think you're on mute. I'm not hearing you.
There, can you hear me now?
Yeah, and if you could be a little closer
Okay,
to your mic,
I'll
I
get
think
a little
we can hear you.
closer. Okay.
Yeah, there you go. Thank you.
I mean, I do think right now it's the fact that there isn't a coordinated office or place to go, and it isn't clear that one person necessarily has decided that this is their most important goal. And again, I do look at our success in clinicaltrials.gov, where you had a small group of people that said, we are going to work with the IRB to get the data. We're going to work with the clinical trial management system to know when the study is ending. We have biostatisticians and data managers available for the team if they're having difficulty, uploading and providing checklists on how to do this. So as we go forward, we will try to duplicate that. We are going to have to work on the data sharing components. I also think that consenting, this is where kind of what becomes the standard. I'm not saying that they do this deliberately, but I have seen a few investigators that have a consent form that's rather restrictive. And then when it comes time to share the data, they'll say, well, look at the consent form. It doesn't allow data sharing. And I think if we really want to promote this, the IRB is going to have to start at the beginning to make sure we don't get restrictive consent forms started. Now, I'm also concerned about how much detail to go into, because it's not only, in that consent form, right? It's not only who's going to be shared with, but the issue about anonymization and risk of re-identification, which is difficult and does have to be there. But we're certainly going to work on a standard definition of data sharing that will, I hope take advantage a little bit better than what we have right now. And again, this is where investigators in clinical research get worried, because recruitment is still the most difficult thing we do in most of our studies. And I don't think there's too many patients that say, I'm not going to join a clinical trial because I'm worried about this data sharing component. But it's possible. And that just seems like one more thing. Like, I'm having a hard enough time getting everybody through consenting. Now I have to spend, 10 minutes on the data sharing component. And it has to become very much a usual, a routine. We may even have to start preparing patients before they see a consent form about why we do this and how to do this, because you don't want to put all the burden on the research coordinators for that side. Also, I do think we have to remember the life of an NIH clinical trialist now is not great. I mean, it takes a long time to get the protocols approved. They're often being asked to conduct the study with some reduction in budget. They're often behind recruitment, so it's the end of the last year of the grant, and they're just trying to get the manuscript done. And this notion that data sharing has to be done before the award is over, and so many people are frantic or not. The end of the end of the grant award period is really tough, and I do think that if this is true, the institutions are going to have to take on more of this responsibility, because at the end of the study, the biostatistician leaves, the data manager leaves, the PI leaves. Who's going to take over that function about making sure data sharing occurring. And it really is that change of mindset at most universities that while we all know the award has been to the university and there's expectations, in general, we have had that flow down to the research team. And it's really going to be the university stepping up and saying, we have responsibilities, for data sharing, just like we have with clinicaltrials.gov, right? A faculty member leaves, there's all sorts of unusual things that can happen. A faculty member dies suddenly. We just went through that. All of those where somebody has to step in and take over the data sharing responsibility.
Great, thank you. Such important points. Susanna, let's hear from you. Susanna Nagy, Duke Vice Dean for Clinical Research.
Yeah, so I would say that Dan really hit the nail on the head, which is how do we think about previous initiatives that have some similarities here and think about how we've managed those. And I think the clinicaltrials.gov reporting is a critical one. And in my opinion, this has to start exactly as Dan said, with being proactive. I look at this like the language and consent forms for genomics research, right? You have to know upfront that this is an expectation so that it is done from the beginning. I would emphasize that the idea here is really in consent process, that this enables the participants' contribution to go as far as possible. So we have to start there, and we have to make sure that that sort of language is an expectation in our consent templates, which is something that we have had success with at Duke. And we have a phenomenal IRB that is a great partner with us on things like this. Whereas we have moved forward initiatives like return of research results and sharing and contributing to third parties, that we ensure that that language is part of the consent form. And then if a team removes that language, we kind of want to understand why that's happening and what the justification for that is. I think the other is critical. If we're going to do this and we're going to achieve 100% compliance, like we have at Duke with CT, clinicaltrials.gov reporting, this is always the question that Ara and Dan and all of us have to think about: to centralize or not to centralize? That is the question. We have found that the centralization of support for CT.gov reporting has been critical to our ability to achieve a 100% compliance. And I think it's really important that the NIH has confirmed that this sort of thing, at least if I understand it, can be in budgets. Because I think this is always the question: is this part of the cost of doing business and indirects, or is this identified as something that we can ensure the teams can get the support for to support that centralization? But I do believe that if we're going to do this right and provide the support that investigators need, and not every investigator is a data scientist, and so we want to make sure that we provide the support, as you said, for the identification or making sure that data is anonymized, for the quality of the data, right? So just putting data up does not mean that it's going to be something that someone can take and begin working on. What is the utilization quality of that data? How quickly can it be translated by another investigator who didn't create the initial variables or data sets or the ECRF that it's being collected into? And so I think if we're going to do this right, we have to ensure that every investigator has the same access to people who can help support all of the IT and data science demands, to make sure that we are putting up a quality piece of information for other investigators to utilize. So, and then the other thing I think we've all talked about is the incentivization, right? So how do we get people to want to participate? How do we get scientists and investigators and faculty to do this? And I think you're aware of this, but Duke recently did their appointments, promotions, and tenure requirements. And open science is now part of how you get promoted at Duke. It is viewed, we all view citizenship, and I love that you use the term scientific citizenship. So it's not just faculty citizenship and sitting on committees and things like that, which is really important, but it's scientific citizenship. How are you contributing to the scientific community? And now Duke recognizes that as a means and an expectation for promotion. And I think these should be incentives for faculty. And it also shows that this is something that institutions value and expect as part of being a faculty member at that institution. So these are things I think that we can start doing. But I think the challenges, as Dan already highlighted, are going to be all the support that's going to be required to do this right and to meet the expectations in a true fashion and not just as a box to check.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Susanna. Ara, your thoughts.
Thank you. Yeah, so obviously on the issues of the IRB have already been mentioned and how do you sort of facilitate upfront with that. And Kim is going to talk about that part, so I'm going to jump to some of the other things. What works well for us and is this question of, who and how and who's in charge, and nobody is in charge in the sense that this is an activity that has multiple offices who are stakeholders who own, the IT infrastructure, the research office, the libraries, and so on. And I think what works for us well is that we have great support from the leadership at the institutional level, be it the library, the IT, the provost, the vice provost for research, our office, who have actually put some kind of support, both what I would call moral and financial, behind this to help us start working, sort of moving in that direction. So for example, our approach to facilitate this has been to put a working group together, which is made up of experts in the various areas, including researchers who have done a fabulous job of contributing their time and effort in starting to put some of the resources and some of the things together. In fact, the library has dedicated an entire website to the research data management program where these tools are residing, and we're sort of advertising it as a central point for the faculty to go to. And if you go to the site, we're fortunate enough that we are a partner institution with the DMP tool organization. So we have created templates there, which not only meets the funder requirements, but also Harvard specific. And we have also provided sort of additional click points on where they can store the data. Obviously, being a partner with Vivli, it sort of helps to point people and said, here is a place for you to go. So I think that has been kind of very helpful in sort of spreading the word, but also trying to come up with a coherent institutional level approach to this. Not that it's easy, but we've been doing, I think, a yeoman's job. As a good example, just sort of to sort of call out one, is our medical school, the Countway Library, has actually dedicated a number of staff members who are there to help the faculty to actually think through these issues and work upfront their needs. They provide sort of webinars, they provide sort of educational materials and consultation. And the fact that there has been some infusion of funding or some support from the leadership of this program, be it the library or IT, means that the faculty, at least for now, they don't have to worry about where do I get the support, who do I consult, or do I have to get a consultant. So that's kind of what's worked. There are pain points, obviously, and the challenges that we have. And I think Dan sort of dealt with one of those issues, that this is much more diverse, kind of the policy applies to a much more diverse group than just the clinical trial group, so the people who were traditionally doing clinical trials. And as I was thinking about this, actually, I sort of started drawing some parallels between this and a few years ago, where if you remember when NIH sort of expanded the definition of what falls under clinical trial, and we had a very large group of researchers who never considered the human subject research, which was basic research, as clinical. And we had to go through this entire educational program. And considering sort of the portfolio of the research, especially NIH funded that we have, that's one of our challenges, sort of the education and bringing them into the sort of this fold of kind of why this needs to be done and why this is important. And I think, sort of the issue of the money has come up while NIH has kind of indicated that some of the initial, during the duration of the grant, these costs are allowable. There's a series of questions that have come up. What do we do in the longer term? We have the funding up front to help you put the plans together. you have some money, from NIH in your grant to manage it during it. And I think that's one of the bigger challenges that we'll have to think about. The other thing that has come up in terms of, for us at least, is we do have a substantial number of researchers who also are engaged in international research. And sort of this issue of the regulatory component of how do we make sure that what we can do with the data that is generated in the US is kind of allowable with the data that is generated outside of US. And Ida, you know much better than I do the painfulness of things like GDPR and so on. So that's another one of the challenges that we're struggling, if that's the right word to use it, how to do.
Great. Yes, a lot of challenges, worthwhile challenges to address.
Yes.
Certainly, just a quick plug on Vivli that if you do share your data set on Vivli, we do manage it. After your grant funds run out, we host the data, we manage requests to it. I think that's one of the pain points that's so obvious to us as investigators that Vivli is directly addressing. There's a question in the chat that actually leads right into the next part of our webinar. And the question is, how are we envisioning accommodating these data sharing requirements in the context of consenting patients at the start of projects, including human subjects? So thank you, Gretchen Kaiser, for that question, because it just tees us up perfectly for Kim Serpico, who will be giving us an overview of these IRB issues for the next 5 minutes. Kim is Harvard Associate Director for IRB Operations, and I'm happy to forward your slides for you, Kim. Go ahead.
Sure. Thank you for that introduction, Ida, and thanks for having me today. Good afternoon, everybody. It's so nice to be with you. As mentioned, my name is Kim Serpico, and I am the Associate Director for IRB Operations for the Harvard Longwood Campus IRBs. And just to be specific, that includes the IRB panels for the Harvard School of Public Health, Harvard Medical School, and the Harvard School of Dental Medicine. So today, my portion of this talk is going to describe the frontline IRB perspective when reviewing data sharing requests. And we're talking about prior to and under this new policy. So really a tactical approach to how our IRB ensures regulatory and ethical compliance is in place for these issues. I should mention that I'm speaking directly to how the Harvard Longwood Campus IRBs think about compliance with data sharing policies, but our hope is that these strategies will be useful to everybody on the call. You'll see here that I've divided data management and sharing considerations into two kind of categories on this slide. The first is retrospective considerations, and the second column is about prospective considerations. And so we'll start it off with the retrospective considerations. So, of course, we would hope that projects would include provisions at the outset for data sharing. Ida had mentioned this before. But our IRB understands that the older the original project, the less likely that probably is going to be in place, right? So our IRB stance is that we can approve de-identified or aggregate data sharing, provided nothing in the original consent or the original data collection protocol precluded or contraindicated that sharing. So I've included some examples here of consent form language that our IRB would consider as precluding sharing. Obviously, the first two are kind of outright explicit, your data will not be shared, or the only person that will ever see this data is the research team. But the third one is if we hypothetically think about a study that's related to a COVID-19 request use, but the data sharing language in the consent form had said something like, we're going to share your research for future, we're going to share your data for future research on cancer treatment, we would also see that as precluding that sharing because it is not for the same use. It's pretty intuitive. Another option for researchers who want to share retrospective data, obviously that's on the table, is to recontact and reconsent all of the original participants to get their consent now to share their data. This could be quite resource, time, labor intensive, so probably not an ideal solution, but it is possible. And our IRB would approve something like that if there was a management plan in place before they implemented that kind of recontact and reconsent strategy. Great, so moving along to the second part, which is the prospective consideration of all of these data management and sharing plans under the policy, is that obviously prospective adherence to this policy is a lot more straightforward, of course. Our IRB would expect that the initial application would include two main components at minimum. And the first is written plans in our research protocol that would outline how research data will be managed and shared. So some examples are the PI should explain where the data is going to be stored, for how long, who will have access, how they will gain access, if there will be a data use agreement, whether data will be individually identifiable, coded, or de-identified. And just as a sidebar, going back to some of the previous thoughts, that those terms would need to very explicitly defined so that the IRB is on the same page with the researcher about what exactly coded means. And then lastly, where the results will be returned to the data provider. So we would expect all of that in a protocol that would be approved. And then the second component would be obviously the consent form. We've been talking about this throughout, where consent forms explicitly describe data sharing and or future uses of the data. So I've included a variety of examples here of consent form language that our IRB provides investigators that we would see as acceptable, that there is a clear conveyance here of intent to share data, or very specifically an explicit question to say, can we share this? Can we use this for future research? I won't read them. This is a wall of text. I'm sorry. I don't usually like slides like that, but I did want to provide some language here. And that's the broad overview. I thank you for your time and attention. That's my bit, but I look forward to any questions.
Thank you. It was so useful to have actual wording, even though it is a wordy slide. It really is really useful. I think this is exactly what investigators are looking for, and I think to have templates to share is great. And that's actually for all of us. You know, one question was, how do we sort of help the whole academic community move forward, because we're all facing these challenges together. Any thoughts from the panelists on that question?
Well, one thing I can jump in and say that, for example, with the DMP tool, you know, the online sort of, once you log in, one of the things that we are using, obviously, you know, I have to ask Kim if she has seen any of them so far, is that we have provided additional support there to help them as in the, you know, so the people who are putting the plan together, to call out specific sections that can be used for the IRB application. So we have said, you know, here is the template, here is sample language, some of which is coming from the IRB that you should use in your management plan, and then sort of pull these out and put them into your consent form. So that's one way that we could continue and sort of improve, because that really is upfront helping the faculty to think about what needs to go to their consent form, but also make the two relatively consistent. I don't know, Kim, if you have seen or you want to comment on that.
I haven't seen any of those come through directly, but I have certainly pointed people, our research community, in the way of that website. The other thing that I would just mention too is I mentioned, you know, written plans in the protocol. One of the kind of late end project pieces that investigators don't always think about that our tool provides is this life cycle management, right? It's the start to finish. And, you know, our researchers are really just thinking about, let's get started, let's get the work up and running. But in terms of regulatory compliance with record retention, we also need to think about the end of the life cycle too, and where things will be stored. If somebody is leaving our institution, what happens to that data? What are the plans in place? And how can that be retained if there are those plans to move across different institutions or collaborate in that way too? So a life cycle approach really, I think, makes our researchers think holistically, which is not something that they're used to do when they're thinking about pre-awards of their grants, getting the human subjects pieces up and running. So just another thing to think about.
So
That's a really good frame.
Well, that statement, those are helpful. Where we usually have the most difficulty is around the risk statement related to data sharing. And I noticed these don't include the risk statement. You know, I don't know how you've dealt with that. I mean, it's, you know, because that's really what we're trying to say. This may say which is what's done. We would try to frame it into the benefits, but then we still, you know, have to identify if we believe there's any risk. I think we all believe there's an increased risk with data sharing of re-identification. We just don't know how much that is.
So that actually, I have a question in the chat addressing that. A lot of the risk that is top of mind is the risk of having patients be re-identified in the data. So the question is, why is there a need to take reconsent if we're not sharing any PHI or PII, de-identified data for future research should not be an issue. Tim, you want to address that one, or why don't you start off with that one?
Sure. I will be more specific there. We would only expect recontact or reconsent for identifiable data sharing. If there's no PHI or it's de-identified, sure, that is completely acceptable. It would be specifically any sensitive research data or identifiable data that I would want to see somebody actively consent to at that point.
And so just to be very clear, your stance would be that if data is de-identified, indeed if it's anonymized, then there is no reconsent and the data can be shared, right?
Exactly. Yep. That would be acceptable to our IRB, absolutely.
Okay, yeah, that's often an issue of confusion for many. Another question, what is the panel's view on a total blanket approach to sharing all clinical trial data? So it's a bit long, I'll just read it. We know from existing reports from some repositories that often only a relatively small percentage of those deposited data have actually been requested. Very true. It's a tricky question because a lot of work might go into preparing data that may never be accessed or used. Equally, if data are only provided on an on-demand basis, possibly long after a trial is completed, then it will be harder to prepare the data for sharing. Thank you. I believe it's Larissa for that question, directly on point. Comments from the panelists? A total blanket approach to sharing all clinical trial data.
Well, I mean, there obviously has to be a balance between the work it takes and the expectation that it'll be looked at. I mean, you know, I think the area where, and it's very important in institutions around pilot data, small pilot data where there's not a large team, yet it can be incredibly important data, right? I mean, pilot data, 10 people, but 2 people had a serious adverse event, and everybody should know that and stop it. So to me, that's the challenge, and that's again where there's a big institutional responsibility, because I over and over say that pilot data is just as important as the large data. It impacts on what you know, interventions, what research path goes forward, and we need to put as much attention on small pilot data as we do as the large. But it's also possible that a feasibility study or whatever would never be shared. So I don't know the right answer to this. We have to find that balance.
Yeah, I would certainly agree. I mean, I think if we've learned anything from biorepositories, it's that more samples sit in a freezer than ever get used. And I think it probably will be very important for us, whether it's via pilots or, you know, Dan raises the concept of feasibilities, trying to understand from potentially very large data sets, are there certain variables, types of data that would be requested, that would be highly requested versus others, and maybe you do focus on only those parts. And the question is, do we have existing data that help us understand what those variables are? Do we ensure that we monitor usage to now understand how to guide those initiatives moving forward? I agree with Dan. I don't know that any of us have an answer on that, but it is something we need to be very, very aware of. Otherwise, I think you do spend a lot of resources without any real impact.
I agree. I mean, I personally, I tend to be more in favor of let's share as much as we can, because as you have indicated, you may not have used or you may not find something in it. Somebody else might look at it and a light bulb goes on and is valuable. But what's that right balance? You know, sort of, to some extent, to me, it's always the question of you don't know what you don't know. And if you don't have access to the data, you don't know whether it's valuable. So somewhere there is a good balance that we need to sort of be thinking about, is that, you know, yes, there is a cost and effort associated with putting this, but at what point we say, you know, we really are not going to use this. Is it worth putting it into the public domain, having others take a look at it?
I'd like to respond to that excellent question. That a lot of the expense of preparing a data set is is the actual data itself and the anonymization of that data. There's also cost and effort in collecting and sharing the metadata of that study. So the metadata is like, what is this study about? How many patients are in it? What are the outcomes? And all that kind of stuff that tells you if you're even interested in that study. And I think we must have a clear metadata. And if that's really clear, then it'll be easier for people to track, do I want this data set or not? And then if we have all the provenance and the common data elements and data format, then we can go and anonymize it. So that step we can defer. So I think we need to think about, making data findable, right, as an NIH fair, and then accessible. And then if you really want it, then we can make it interoperable and usable. So we need to think about it in a stage process. Again, more complexity for us to be thinking about. Two other questions. Next one is, oh boy, okay. Are there considerations for informed consents and secondary use where explicit uses are not currently known? I think you sort of addressed that. Are things like GDPR differentiating for studies in the EU?
I think I did address some of that first part of that, but I can jump in and talk about the GDPR differentiating studies for sure. At Harvard, we are looking very closely at that and require, if data obviously is coming from the EEA or the EU, that there are pieces of contractual language that are in those agreements. We've had researchers that found that to be a barrier. We've had researchers that had no problem with getting that language in their agreements. And going back to whether or not that existed in the consent form, of course it didn't prior to the GDPR going live, but we've found a way to make that work within the agreements, and or for any reconsent, we have sort of a GDPR participant addendum or an information sheet if it was possible to go back. So we have kind of all three lanes of options, using the retrospective data, recontacting participants, and then prospectively consenting with that language. So we've kind of thought about it in all of the broad different ways.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing I would add, Kim, to what you just said is also the IRB has done a great job of actually having sample language, in the consent form for the GDPR studies. So there is they have template language or sample language which I thought that they did an excellent job of actually adding that. So.
Sounds like templated language is super important and a sort of somewhat of a low-hanging fruit.
Yes.
Next question. Ara mentioned data management plans and connecting them to the IRB. Have others done more in this area or looked at more training for IRBs on data sharing and preservation, repositories, processes, curation, that whole ball of wax there? Connecting data management plans to IRBs and training on that.
I mean, data management plans are required as part of our IRB submission. So our that's reviewed, and we have a review process. Our clinical research is done through what we call clinical research units. Every department, institute, or center lives within a unit. And the unit leadership and or unit reviewer, all of whom are faculty, have to review those plans as well. So we have a faculty level reviewer, and then the IRB similarly has trained staff who look at those. So that is something that's been part of our data management. Now, as we move forward to something that's more extensive in terms of sharing, I think whether we need to expand that training and those reviews, I think may be possible, but I think we have a good framework to already build from.
I mean, to the extent that the IRB does the job at the beginning, it gets a good consent form. The role for the IRB in the actual data sharing or data use agreements afterwards is less, because they don't have, they'll say they used a broad consent form. Yes, now it's up to somebody else to make sure the data use agreements have the appropriate restrictions from the institution.
Sounds like the IRB has a huge role in this at the start of a study to set everything.
Ida, you went on mute, I think.
Ida, we lost you.
Ida, can you hear us? Okay, I think Ida's having some technical difficulties, so we'll give her a minute to come back in. But in the interest of time, we have one last question I think we can fit in here. Ooh, there we go. Ida, we lost you. You might need to say that again.
Oh, sorry. Any recommendations for commercial sponsors on how to approach investigators for data sharing purposes? Dan, I think you've had some thoughts on this issue.
Well, I do think it's, the question, so the commercial sponsors needs to really think through the ownership of the data and the use of the data. And I mean, while it's, it was mentioned a little bit, the biospecimens fall under the exact same, area where biospecimen sharing and that. I think that, again, beginning to get closer to master agreements, how to know it. I do think for the IRBs, we oftentimes wonder about, do research participants have to know if there's a difference with sharing in the commercial world versus sharing in the, within the not-for-profit academic world? I think we're having to figure that out. I mean, it's becoming a norm that there's lots of data sharing, although if you go to patient groups, they still see a difference between data sharing with companies versus data sharing with other researchers. And again, I think where this is, research is multi-center. We've got to be on the same page with this. We have to continue to work with, I think, with patient groups to understand that, and we should probably come to some common understanding of it, because again, most of these trials are not one site. There are 20 sites, and we can't all do it separately.
And Ida, if I can just add one point to what Dan said, and it's with the multi-site studies, I think it's also extremely important, not just with the sponsor, but amongst ourselves. And that's one of the things that collectively we could do to, as we're sort of putting these multi-center trials or studies, to be much more cognizant of this and come up to common agreements upfront on the data sharing, on the language, even the consent forms, even though we might be using a single IRB process, that we are all on the same page, that what are we going to share and how we're going to share. So it's both the sponsor, but also the multiple sites. We need to kind of think about it as how we can collectively contribute to making this more successful. I don't know, Susanna or Dan, would you agree?
Yeah, I agree.
Very much agree.
Thank you so much. And that's a ending on agreement, but I think it's calling out that this is it's really a shift in how we're thinking about data and how we participate and how we conduct science. And so happy that NIH has given us the opportunity to sort of shift directions. And thank you so much to our panelists for some very useful thoughts and some very concrete advice on how we are moving forward. Thank you to everybody who has attended. A reminder that the webinar is recorded and you will be able to access the recording for later reference. So thank you very much. Please enjoy your Juneteenth and also the upcoming weekend.